Harvestime Church, this is Alyssa. Welcome to The Secretary. Here we will dive into the nitty-gritty discussions about God and how to live a real life. I am Alyssa Toms, a secretary from Harvestime Church in Wisconsin. With my desk sitting in the middle of the office, I get to be a part of the pastor's eureka moments and amazing discussions. But only a portion makes it into the sermon on Sunday. I want to bring you into my world of being in the crossroads of these amazing conversations.
Today we have Kyle Rude, our youth pastor at Harvestime Eau Claire. He has 3 kids and a wife, an amazing wife that teaches piano named Carly. And we get to see her often because she actually gets to come in and teach piano here right in Kyle's office. Kyle is known around the office for being satirical, asking a lot of questions and getting some random answers as well. It's pretty fun around here. He definitely adds a lot of life to the office. He is also the life group pastor, which around harvest time, we kind of go by this motto of doing life together, doing life in circles rather than rows, as he would say. His life group, for example, was find the best burger in Eau Claire. And that life group consisted of going out and eating different burgers around the city, which is what it's about. I mean, we're basically building a community and having those like genuine, unique friendships with people that we see every week or multiple times a week right at the campus. So it's kind of fun. Kyle is also known for trying a little bit of every hobby he can get his hands on. So currently he's in carpentry, but he's been known to fish, golf, do music. So like this life group kind of idea is very perfect for him, kind of getting his hands in everything. In fact, he just built a bookshelf or put together one that I've been putting off for way too long for the office. So anyway, welcome, Mr. Pastor Kyle.
Hey, good day.
Good day. Good day, sir.
Good day. Depending on when you're listening to this, it'll be a morning or evening or...
Yeah, for those who are listening during the morning, good morning. And good night for those.
Yeah.
Well,
nothing soothes the soul like my voice right before bedtime. So just buckle up, Buttercup. Here we go.
So we're acting so funny, but today we're going to be talking about Revelation. So let's get serious about this. I'm just kidding. Actually, Revelation could be quite fun because the reason we're talking about this is for the past month or month and a half, Kyle has been coming into the office talking about Revelation because that is what the youth, the Harvestime youth, the Catalyst youth, were talking about all that month. And so he kind of had to do some research into that category. And I don't know, you learned some stuff. I know you came into my office talking about a few things that you learned. And we'll cover that. But first off, how long have you been in youth ministry as a leader? And what is your favorite part about being a youth pastor?
So I've been the youth pastor at Harvestime for 10 years. And then before that, I was the youth pastor at a church called Praise Christian Center in the Cities for about 3 years. And so yeah, about 13 years of youth ministry under my belt. And then my favorite part of youth ministry, that's really...
You play a lot of games.
Yeah.
But that can't be the favorite, right?
No, right. No. Well, I do enjoy, I love having fun, so that's part of why we do games, is I think fun breaks down walls and things like that. But I definitely love to see when students have that aha moment with God. And so it's that for the student who's never made Jesus Christ the Lord of their life, that moment, I love being able to be a part of that moment is just, it's honoring, and it's like, holy cow, Jesus, you're using me to be a part of this integral moment where this soul's meeting an eternal Savior, and that's the one of the highlights for me. Also, seeing the student at light bulb go off of they're finding their passion, and then us as youth leaders being able to help kind of foster those passions and see them like that spark of like, wait, I can use my baking and use it to glorify God, or I can use my sport or my social media or whatever it is and use it to glorify God, like that they don't have. Like to be able to just use that on an everyday basis, and that's really the fun part of seeing them be able to live that out in the day to day.
And that's really cool because when you say that, I think about how involved you were in this, and I say fine arts because it used to be more of like a actual like you go to fine arts, but you're actually implementing it more of like we're doing like a service coming up here, for example, to exemplify these things that these students do that honor God, that are not necessarily like, well, you don't need to, honoring God doesn't just look like this. It can look like God made you creative and he made you special. Yeah. So it's cool to hear that's one of your favorite parts. Is that what you did when you were a youth grouper? Like, did you encounter Christ that way?
Oh, yes and no, because I went to youth group starting back in the 1900s, so 1999.
It sounds so old.
And so it does, doesn't it?
But I did too, but it just sounds old.
Yeah. So like
this is what I'm talking about, these satirical. Okay.
So I was like, I was part of doing some human videos and some dramas and stuff like that in our youth group, but it wasn't as prevalent or as the thing, because we had for a few years at our church we had a master's commission, so that was more like when that was really like at the height. Their master's commissions went with their height. They did more of the dramas and things, and so but yeah, so yes and no, but yes, I'd say. So how did I encounter God though? Is that what the question?
Well, sort of. I just know that's your favorite part, and I imagined that was that roughly the age that you kind of. I know your dad was a pastor, or is a pastor.
Yeah.
But like, is that where you actually genuinely encountered God for the first time? Was in youth?
So I'd say I had genuine encounters in like kids' church and through middle school. But it wasn't until my junior year where I made that decision for myself. Mm-hmm. So I remember there's like this moment where I was like, I'm tired of the way I'm living, and I knew I needed Jesus, and I knew that there was more to life than the way I was living at that time. And so it was that junior year, and there was just this revelation that happened, and it was like, I need Jesus. So
we'll have to do another time where we have you come and talk about how in that part of your life when you met Carly and that pursuit, because that's a really cool story too. But but that was kind of around that time where you were in that junior kind of, you were figuring things out, and God provided Carly, which is really great. But we'll talk about that later, because I definitely want to get into what we were talking about in the office, which is Revelation. And I personally, I think most new Christians, but in general, most Christians are drawn to the book of Revelation because it's so different than a lot of the other books in the Bible. But I think I have to admit that I've actually been a little bit putting it off myself, just because there's so much to unpack there. And I personally wanted to, I as a new Christian, I wanted to know who's Jesus? How does he matter in my life? And then eventually move into that whole, okay, here's this big revelation of Jesus that I need to unpack or get some insight in. But now that we've been talking about it, is quite fascinating. And what made you pick to go through the study of Revelation in youth? What was kind of your idea starting that off?
Just because it's a book that it does have it's shrouded in mystery, and students typically, they like the thought of the end of the world. They like a conclusion, and that's what Revelation, or actually, I found out from Pastor that it's like I don't know why I never thought of it, but yeah, the book is actually called The Revelation of Jesus Christ, and so and there's a blessing in reading that and studying it, and so I just wanted our students to start to just, because there's no way. For 20, 30 minutes on a Wednesday night, are we going to be able to unpack the entire book of Revelation? But it's kind of like here, it's like an appetizer. Like, here, eat this, and then eventually the goal would be, oh, I like that. I'm going to go back for more. And so that was kind of the thought process.
Did you see that engagement in youth?
Yeah, and especially the questions.
A lot of questions, huh?
Tons of questions.
Did you have all the answers? Just go read the Bible, kids.
Yeah, that's basically. Well, we're not sure. This is what do you think it means?
That's a great answer. Actually, that is an answer.
Yeah. No, but we did our best, and we didn't pretend to know every single detail about all the things, but there were some definitely truths that were these are unwavering. These are this is where you can land, and this is a good docking or anchoring point where you don't need to.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's definitely a feat. When you said you were doing it, I was like, woo.
Yeah.
There's some lighter topics you could choose, but that's something. So, and since for just for actually my sake, but also like the listener's sake too, I suppose, would you be able to lay out kind of a timeline or like the layout of Revelation and so at least the pieces that you focused on, or how did you organize it in your, what kind of focuses you had in your youth group?
Great. Yeah, we took a really kind of general but specific, I don't know. Let me explain it. So we started off with, we had a big piece of white, like, butcher paper on the wall. And then we started with the very beginning. So before time even began, there was God. And then we fast forwarded, and then we had like a little bullet point on a timeline that we made. And then that timeline is like, oh, this is where God made time and space and matter and everything. And then this is where like the Old Testament would have been somewhere in there. And then the New Testament happened, which we explained. This is where Jesus came on the scene, and this is where he died on the cross. And then we got to the end, where it's Revelation. And so there is kind of like the culmination of why we study the book of Revelation, is because it's the end, and we've got all of this culminating, and can be kind of scary. It can be kind of like, and so. So the general timeline that we have is sorry, I got off topic, but the general timeline goes from when Jesus died on the cross. There's this kind of time that we're in right now, and then eventually there's going to be a rapture of the saints, where Jesus is going to come, and then those who are dead in Christ and those who are alive are going to meet him in the clouds. And so then at that point, there's a judgment for what you did. You get your crowns. We're going to lay them at Jesus' feet. With the rapture, at that point, I explained that there's going to be a tribulation. It's going to be a 7-year tribulation. The first 3.5 years are going to be bad, and then the last 3.5 years are going to be terrible. There's going to be a second coming of Christ, and that's where there's going to be a battle of Armageddon at Armageddon, and then he's going to cast Satan and this character known as the Antichrist and all of the Antichrist minions into this bottomless pit, and then they're going to be cast into this, and then for 1,000 years Christ is going to reign, and then there's going to be one final, God's going to release Satan one more time, and then there's this great white throne judgment where basically you're either known, your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life, or you're not, and those who aren't are going to be cast in the lake of fire, including Satan, death, hell, and the grave, the final enemies of God. And then at that point, Jesus is going to create a new heavens and a new earth. And so it's kind of a very specific general timeline that we kind of explained and kind of gave people. So if you can write it out, it's very helpful to be able to see it, because being able to just talk about it's a little tough. So hopefully Google it, and you'll kind of get a general idea of what we're talking about.
Yeah, it definitely, I feel like even just preparing for the podcast, I didn't do as much. I wanted to reread Revelation and kind of do my own, but honestly, there's just a lot. I mean, even reading through it, it's like I don't even know if I would have been in a better situation than I am now, because even you explaining it, I'm like, wow. And then I had all these questions about meanings and stuff, even with that explanation. And then there's tons more to unpack even on top of that. So what is the theme for it? Are there some central themes with Revelation that you honed in on specifically? And if so, like, was it a very somber study, or was it actually pretty enlightening and fun because we are saved, Yeah. So well, how did that work?
It can be heavy because there's a lot of dark things that are going to happen on the earth. There's going to be a lot of things that are troubling. But the big thing is that at the end of it all, and I use the phrase we win, but actually we don't win. Jesus wins, and his victory becomes our victory. And so there's this ultimate victory. There's an ultimate hope. There's an ultimate of hope that the wrongs that we've experienced, Jesus is going to finally bring justice to things. Because we're not always promised justice. We're promised justice, but that justice doesn't mean that we're promised that it's going to be exactly when we want it, but we're promised justice. And so the wrongs that have happened to people, the abuses that have happened to people, there will be a justice. You might say, well, I didn't get my justice today, but there will be one eventually that you're going to get, that just brings hope. It brings hope that there's not going to be death anymore. There's not going to be, the world that we know it isn't how it was originally designed. There's death and decay and atrophy. Those things aren't going to exist anymore once we get to the culmination of at the very end of things. And so it's encouraging, but it's also can be kind of scary. And so that was kind of the big thing that we hit on, is that our hope isn't in the here and now. Our hope is in that God's creating something that's bringing it back to how it was supposed to be. And something I learned that I thought was actually fascinating was the very first book of the Bible is like perfection personified. And then the next, like basically the first 2 chapters. But then the third chapter, there's the fall. And then the very last 3 chapters of Revelation, you've got God dealing with Satan and the all of his minions, and then restoring perfection. And so it's like this perfect matched bookends. So like you have perfection at the very last 2 chapters, and then the fall, and then God correcting the fall. And it's like this, I love finding those kind of where you're like, wait, this matches. So it's just so important to know the Old Testament to be able to see the New Testament fully realized as well.
When you're saying that too, it makes me think a lot of the Bible is like that. And even Pastor will say it where there's just ties in, or like things are sandwiched together in between Bible verses. And that's like the Bible has those characteristics, like how it was written is a lot like that. And so that would make sense that that Revelation be that way too. But it's kind of cool to see how he did it with the promises. Mm-hmm. And it starts it starts hopeful and ends hopeful. So even though there's some stuff that happens in between, like the ultimate surrounding, like the surrounding guts of it is going to be good. It's going to be hopeful. It's like the only reason why God is good, and he would do this for his good. And so it's cool that there's going to, like, that there is an end, but it's. And
for the literary people, are like, oh, they like just the symmetry in it.
Me.
Yeah. When you can have that symmetry, and there's definitely no accident in that.
Yeah, you have a couple pieces of material in front of you. I was kind of glancing at. He has some papers of how he, like the tribulation.
Yes.
That's that word. I was going to ask you more about that, actually. I was interested in what it meant, the tribulation. Like, what is the Great Tribulation?
Ooh. So, I'm just going to go off of, what we taught about. And so we've got, so the Great Tribulation takes place after the rapture of the saints, and it's that 7-year window. And the Antichrist comes on the scene, and the Antichrist will set up a one-world government, a one-world currency, and a one-world religion. And so it's going to be kind of chaos. You have to take the mark of the beast, and John talks about that number being 666, and you can, like, basically, if you study it, you can kind of figure out what he's talking about. One thing I learned that I didn't have really fully understand is specifically in the 7 trumpets and the 7 seals, you've got the sea turning to blood, the sun darkening, you've got like livestock dying, and it's interesting just when you look at the 10 plagues of Egypt, how many of them tie in to into these tribulations as well, and just the mirroring, and John pulling the writer, because his intended audience would have been Jewish, so they would have caught a lot of these already, and they would have seen, they would have made those connections just naturally because of their culture. And so as a 20th century Christian, are we 21st now or 20th still?
21st, I believe.
Okay.
It's okay.
As a 19th century Christian.
Them too would apply.
Yeah, but as a Christian in American culture today, we don't naturally make these connections, and to see just how much those plagues tie into this, and just how there's a repetition that God does, that he's almost cyclical, where you can see him working. So what he once did before, how he won't be the exact same way, but just how he brings it right back.
Parallels there. Kind of speaking of that, when we were talking a little bit with Pastor Kim, he mentioned something about, for one, people are very consumed by Revelation, which we talked about. They, especially right when they are Christian, they're like, what is this weird book? Mm-hmm. But how does this book apply to people of that, like kind of mentioned, like that time versus people of our time? Because it seems that we would have different perspectives based on our culture. For one, we're all the way across the world of the people who this was originally written to, but also the time, like we're thousands of years.
Yeah. And
or
so,
maybe just 1,000 years from this book. I don't know when it was written, actually.
I think this would have been one of John's latter books. He probably would have written this on the Isle of Patmos, I believe. And I think it would have been in like year 88 or 90, something in there, AD. And so, but that I could be a little bit off, so I apologize if I don't know the exact date, but it's somewhere in there.
1.7,000 years.
Yeah, exactly, whatever that might be.
Yeah. 1.3,000 years. I don't know. But anyway, just completely different viewpoints, and that can also alter a text, as we've learned.
Yeah.
So how do you think of that?
So it's so important to know, just specifically, John mentions these numbers in Revelation 666. And so it's this mark of the beast, and that's a scary, like we talked about that, and that's a scary thing. And is it a literal mark? Is it a metaphorical mark? And that's one of those questions where I'm like, I believe it's a yes. I think it is yes. It's a literal and a metaphorical mark, and I kind of landed on it with our students that I think that eventually there will be a mark that you'll be able to take. That's the beast, but also I'd be less concerned about that and more about the seal of the Holy Spirit on your heart. That's the mark. That's the most important thing, because I don't think it's something you're going to be tricked into taking. Anyway, so let's go back to the original question, though, of the 666 to the original Hebrew reader. So in Hebrew, you have the letters, and then the letters means the letter, kind of A, but then they also represent something more than they're just, so like A is for, and you could fill in apple, right? So,
and don't the symbols in Hebrew kind of look like those things too?
Yes.
And so it is almost like, this is my perception, so correct me if I'm wrong, but when you were showing me this in the office, it looked like for the symbol for, like, this is just a really bad example, but like O is ox, and it looked like an ox head, kind of, like the symbol did, which was really cool because, yeah.
There's a pictographical meaning to the letter, and there's a numerical meaning to the letter. And so you've got the Antichrist, who's labeled as 666. And so if you do this kind of, and we don't have the code breaking, like there's like if you have like the certain
Rosetta Stone.
Yeah, the Rosetta Stone, how everything fits perfectly. We don't have that quite like those first century Christians would have, or Jewish Christians would have had. And so, but when we do some studying into it, we notice that 666 perfectly would have mirrored the name Nero, who would have been the emperor of Rome at the time, who was persecuting Christians. And so you've got this, and he would have made himself into God. He would have set himself up to be God, setting up a one world religion, setting up this one world government and one world economy. And so everything fits to kind of point to that Nero is a type of Antichrist. And so that's just one of those things. And also another character that gets mentioned is the beast, which is something that the first century Jewish Christians would have called Nero. And the numbers would have been 666.
I feel like we should do a study on those correlations with Nero. Like that's interesting to me, because we sit here and think, who's the, I mean, we ask, like, who's the Antichrist, and what is the beast, and will it be as vicious as it sounds and stuff? But you're making it sound like our perceptions, because of when and who, like where we live, are completely different on the scripture that we're trying to interpret. So it's really difficult to actually interpret it, what the original intent was.
Yeah, so I think there is an original intent, but also I think there's an application for today, where it's like, I think he was literally talking about Nero, or a Nero kind of person. But then I think also there's the spirit of Antichrist. That's, the name says it, it's against Christ, and is setting up his own religion, world, and economy. And you'll see, like, because nobody knows the day or hour except for the Father of when all these things are coming about. And so one of the thoughts that that I'm comfortable with kind of leaning on is that we don't know the time or hour, and neither does Satan. And so Satan has to have an Antichrist available at every hour. And so I'm like, I'm good with that. Like, I'm like, that makes so.
It definitely adds a little bit more of a focus to what we're supposed to be focused on, not, when is this going to happen? Who is this person? And yeah, there's something going on, but the focus is not that, it's who is Jesus? I want to be closer to him. Like, not what is the opposite. So that's interesting. That's cool that you learned something like that.
Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to bring up, if you could expound on, because you did come and talk about this a little bit, and this will be really the last thing before I have there's this thing called Now It's Your Turn, where you come up with something like an activity or a thought that the listeners can meditate on or do in regards to Revelation. So that'll be, but I wanted to ask if you could you tell me a little bit more about the 4 horsemen in the Bible?
Yes.
And who they are and what they stand for, and kind of what you revealed in the youth ministry about them, or what you learned about them.
So they would have been part of the first 4 seals, and so each horse is a different color, and in Revelation 6:2 it says, "I looked up and saw a white horse standing there. Its rider carried a bow, and a crown was placed on his head. He rode out to win," and found and described in Revelation 6:2. So what you've got is these horsemen, and so the first one is kind of like war, or some have equated this to possibly the Antichrist, because it looks like Christ, but when you see Christ described later in Revelation, he's riding a white horse. He's stained in blood. He's got a sword coming out of his mouth, and you see that this rider is slightly different. And so some scholars have believed this. But the big thing in that is that there's going to be war, right? So this represents wars. Another horse that appears is a red horse, and its rider was given a mighty sword and authority to take peace from the earth, and there was war, slaughter, and everywhere. This is the second horseman found in Revelation 6:4. And so, I got confused. This was actually the war one. So you got the Antichrist possibly for the first one. You got the war for the second one. And then the black horse. I looked up and saw a black horse, and his rider was white, holding a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice among the 4 beings saying, "A loaf of bread or 3 loaves will cost a day's pay, and don't waste the olive oil." So this horse would represent famine. And then the last one is a pale green horse. His rider was named Death, and his companion was the grave. And so this is the last horseman that's described in Revelation 6:8. So Revelation 6, if you want to learn more, just read those. You can kind of look more into that. But this one is Death. So you've got the first 4 seals that are broken are kind of this conquest, or which would tie into the Antichrist because he's conquesting. Then you got war, then you've got famine, and then you've got just death. And pestilence is another one that gets brought up for this.
Yeah, I feel like I was introduced to those first, like in Hollywood, like because they try to portray that in different movies and stuff, and so it's cool to hear it actually in your terms here.
Yeah, and just one of the thoughts is because it's like with this end times thing, it's like, well, how do we know when it's end times? Well, we don't know exactly, especially like when you compare it to like having a baby. Like if you have contractions, the contractions will get more and more intense, and so so you have another contraction. And this one was way worse than the last one. So is this the last one that you're going to have before the baby comes? Like, is that and you don't, especially if you've never had a child before, you don't know exactly when the last one's going to be, but you just know it's going to get more and more intense. And I think that ties into the end of this. Like, you notice that there's just an intensity that gets more and more and more and more in the book of Revelation until finally there's a final culmination, and then there's something birthed that's beautiful and changes everything, and that would have been, would be obviously the new heavens and the new earth.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's cool, because it even, like we were talking about before, the sandwiching, like that happened a few times in the Bible where there were contractions and like some sort of hope born, like, and now this is just another one of those almost. Well, I'm interpreting it. I don't know how you did. That's just what I saw.
I thought that was fascinating.
I am less versed on this subject, obviously.
And there's so much more. It's like we've got the 4 living beings. You got the 2 witnesses. You've got the beasts and all these other characters, and it's just this. It's a lot. But when you get down to the brass tacks, I think the big thing is knowing, okay, there's an enemy, there's God, and He wins, and that's where you.
Awesome.
And so that's a really short synopsis of the
victory. Much shorter podcast episode.
Yeah, we could end this in like 30 seconds.
Oh man. Well, anyway, I guess now we could go. Now it's your turn. So, what do you want the listeners to do, Kyle?
If you've never read the book of Revelation, I would challenge you to, in a month, read the book of Revelation. So like a chapter a day. And that would even give you like a couple days where if you miss a chapter, you could still get it done in a month. And it's quite it. Yeah. And so I'd challenge you to do that. And then for those who've maybe read the book of Revelation, one of the maybe like an exercise to try would be like write down that, like if there's an injustice that's happened to you, or there's been a hope that's been derailed, or a dream that just has been crushed, write that down. And just that idea that God could restore that on this side of eternity, but for sure it's going to be restored on the other side of eternity. And so just that hope, So.
100% one. That's awesome. I like both of those. That's great.
So I didn't obey what you said. It was I gave 2.
You did great. That was exactly what I needed. That's exactly what we needed. Thank you, Kyle, for joining us today. And thank you, listeners, for listening. And we'll see you next month on The Secretary. Bum, 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 bum.